Great honor to host Professor Michael Laffan from Princeton University. Michael is coming from Australia. He actually finished his first degree in Australia, and even the second one. In fact, I first read his articles more than 10 years ago, when he wrote about Indonesian interests in Japan. There was this fascinating article about the Egyptian translations, Egyptian writer Mustafa Kemal's Rising Sun being translated into Malay by Indonesians interested in Pan-Asianism and Japan way back, and in fact we met around that time. Then we became neighbors in Princeton, and Michael since then published a very important book, Ummah Under the Wings, which is about Indonesian nationalism, and in fact all of you read Benedict Anderson's book, Imagined Communities, and if you want to know what neglected or incorrect things about this book on Indonesia, you should read Michael's introduction, how Benedict Anderson ignores the role of Islam in the construction of Indonesian nationalism. I was very impressed, and this is one of the books that I am using to write my own book. And then Michael just finished another book. And this is the book that he's going to talk about today, The Makings of Indonesian Islam, which deals with a lot of interesting questions such as colonialism, Orientalism, and Islamic modernism in the making of contemporary Indonesian Muslim identity. So we look forward to hearing Michael's book summary. Michael, what is it?
Well, thanks, Jamil. I think you covered everything there, so we can just eat. I wasn't quite ready for the big format of the room, and I usually prefer to sit when I talk, but given how I have to be sort of connected to my computer, I'll stand if you don't mind. So this is me standing now. I also walk. I'm going to walk in this direction. So first, thanks a lot to Jamil Pasha Sensei for inviting me down here for this talk. I won't talk about Jamil's work. I'll just sort of say that my first project grew out of a dissatisfaction with the narrative of nationalism for Southeast Asia, and whereas the Andersonian narratives privileges the role of Indonesians who go to the Netherlands and think about being Indonesian for the first time perhaps, or who are involved in Dutch study groups, starting to think about their place on the map, so to speak. Whilst I always found that a very interesting narrative, I felt that he left out another story, and that was the connections to Mecca, which were arguably much older and more intensive in many ways, and indeed the later connection to Cairo as an intellectual centre in the Middle East. So that was my sort of first project. This second project is perhaps a little bit too ambitious, but it comes down to my dissatisfaction or frustration whenever the topic of Indonesian Islam comes up, because whenever people say Indonesian Islam, it often conjures up some sort of images, the ideas of a more ironic Islam, of a more tolerant Islam, and there's also background into this. There's a story. I mean, the thing is about Indonesian Islam, what is usually summed up, whether in the New York Times or whatever, is there has to be a small story about when and why Islam came to Southeast Asia. And the usual narrative is that sometime in the 13th century, we're not sure exactly why, mystics travelled from India and managed to harmonise their synthetic sort of understandings of the mystical union between God and man, and were able to harmonise those with extant practices and beliefs in Southeast Asia. And I always felt that there was something a little bit fishy about this story, which is certainly one that is told as much in Indonesia as it is in the academy or in the press. Most recently I saw an article talking about Tarim in Yemen, where people in Yemen were claiming that their specific mystical tolerant Islam had been the one responsible for the conversion of the archipelago, and in fact for the making of the largest, if you only go on nation-state terms, the largest single Muslim nation in the world. Now what I'd like to argue in my current book, The Makings of Indonesian Islam, is that we should rather look for the creation of this narrative to a moment of engagement, of interaction between Dutch colonial scholarship and Islamic reformist scholarship, specifically in the latter part of the 19th century. I try to talk about a few other things in this book, but for the purposes of today, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the specifically colonial aspects of the makings. Now, I say makings deliberately because I use the word in a couple of senses. One, I want to point out that there's not just one narrative. You can have a colonial narrative. You also have to understand the Indonesian narratives and the variant Indonesian narratives that go into the making of an idea of Indonesian Islam. But also, I like to play with the idea of when you say that someone has the makings of something, you say that it's something, you're on the way to getting there, and that it's ultimately something in view or in reach. And so the assumption is, the operative assumption is that there is an Indonesian Islam, but let's look at what was going on when people were sort of trying to put it together. Now, again, I spoke about it being perhaps too ambitious. In the book, I try and really kick in with the first Dutch engagement with Islam in the archipelago at the end of the 16th century and from then on. Now, I think it's fair to say that Islam for the Dutch was long an object of aversion rather than fear or curiosity. Sure, there were moments of contestation, particularly in the Spice Islands, in the Moluccas. That first photograph I showed you was one I took in Ternate, which was one of the leading spice handling entrepôts in the eastern part of Indonesia in the 16th and 17th centuries, and well before, of course. Now, the Dutch certainly made notes on Islamic practices there and even depicted Islamic practices at times. We see here from a work that was published in 1601, we see a depiction of the royal procession to the mosque in Ternate. But that said, I think it's pretty fair to say that thereafter there wasn't very much printed attention given to Islam in Southeast Asia, as opposed to information on the sorts of products that could be brought from Southeast Asia, particularly cloves and other costly spices, particularly in the 17th century. Now, this isn't to say that there weren't Dutch people, Dutch scholars and people from other nationalities who were associated with the Dutch venture who were looking at Islam. It's not to say that they weren't thinking about Islam or writing about it, but there seemed to be a consensus that there wasn't really a market for information about Islam in Southeast Asia. Besides, many Dutch people or Dutch readers felt that they really knew what Islam was anyway. It was one of those bad faiths. It was marginally better than Catholicism, but you know, it was out there and it was a bit of a problem. Indeed, you often see this, that some of the polemics that were written by Dutch scholars were attacks on Catholic scholars arguing about who was really more like a Muslim, the Protestants or the Catholics. Matters would really change, though, in the 19th century, in the early parts of the 19th century, when in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars and the shifting of properties or claims on properties in Asia between the Dutch and the British, the Dutch would attempt to return to the principal islands of the archipelago, most noticeably Java and Sumatra, to press their claims of some sort of tributary alliance with the local rulers. This time, though, there were widespread, there had been resistance in the past, but what the Dutch really noticed was the strong Islamic tone to the resistance that they faced. For example, in the uprising of Prince Diponegoro, seen here at left, which ended in 1830 effectively, the Dutch were quite shocked by the numbers of the so-called santries, that is, the students of religious schools, the pesantren, who were involved in the combat, who had been mobilized against them. And particular teachers such as Kiai Mojo, who was the personal sort of teacher to Pangeran Prince Diponegoro. A lot of questions were raised as to the impetus that had been given by these teachers in shaping the resistance against the Dutch. Similarly, when the Dutch were drawn into the conflict between rival Muslim factions in West Sumatra, I should say that this is a conflict in West Sumatra that is now credited as being a national conflict, as is the Javanese conflict, one that the people were fighting for Indonesian sovereignty against the Dutch, which is much more complicated than that, though. For example, in West Sumatra, Tuanku Imam Bonjol, seen at right here, was one of the last holdouts against the Dutch of a movement that had actually sought initially to challenge local practice of Islam. They had actively burnt down the villages of their rivals. They had tried to stop people carrying out such traditional practices, teeth filing, matrilineal inheritance. Indeed, this is something that's still marked in West Sumatra today, that the property is kept in the hands of the women of the family. And also the widespread consumption of alcohol and opium. Be that as it may, when the Dutch decided to intervene in the conflict from the 1820s, and particularly after they had a free hand on Java in the 1830s, they were struck by the nature of these padris. People who, like the santris in Java, were often dressed in white, were often carrying magical amulets, or amulets written in Arabic, amulets which they usually couldn't read. And indeed, this is one of the points I really like to make, is that a lot of the material that these people carried was not intelligible to the Dutch, despite their long history of engagement with Southeast Asia. Things such as the personal prayer book of Imam Bonjol, which was carried away to Leiden in the 19th century, were not necessarily even read or until much, much later. And then there were questions were usually raised as to who had these people been anyway. Now the finger was usually pointed at the Wahhabiyya by the 1840s and 1850s. In the wake of the defeat of the Wahhabis after their first occupation of Mecca and Medina in the early part of the 19th century, a narrative was increasingly told of how, in the case of Sumatra, 3 particular pilgrims had witnessed the first Wahhabi conquest, had then become inspired, returned to Java, and set off this war against other forms of Islamic practice. This is not really true. If you look at the manuscripts, including this one here, collected by Imam Bonjol, what you find often is a collection of Sufi litanies, prayers, images from the Dalail al-Khairat, a guidebook of Suleiman al-Jazuli, which was widely popular in the Muslim world. But that said, I would like to even go further and say that most of the Dutch scholars, including those who start to talk about potential Wahhabi Padri links, were little apprised of the sort of Islam in Southeast Asia. Indeed, many of those scholars active in the training schools, and now the Dutch had instituted from the 1830s the idea that there had to be specific training on Islam, among other things, for the candidate officials to be sent to the Indies. The metropolitan jurists who studied Islam from texts that had been carried away were much more interested in reproducing those texts, providing source critical analyses of them, and usually critical analyses, and then claiming that, well, if you measured up what was actually said in these texts with what people did on the ground, then you would find that they were very poor Muslims indeed. This sort of narrative was very much in line with a lot of what the missionaries to Java and other places were claiming. They often asserted that the Javanese in particular were at best superficial Muslims, and it wouldn't take much to sort of take off that outer sheen of the Muslim to find the heathen underneath who was ripe for Christianity, they believed. Beyond this though, both the metropolitan trainers who were active with this production of texts, and I should say there were very practical ideas about these production of texts, these Islamic texts, because over the course of the 19th century, culminating in 1882 with the creation of the so-called priest courts, Dutch officials will be overseeing questions of Islamic law. That is, the questions of Islamic law that was left to the native populations, which usually revolved around questions of inheritance or family law. And the idea was that if you equipped a good Dutch official with a nice French translation of a classical Arabic text, then they would be able to resolve anything that might crop up between a local person and the team. I should say that they would create committees of Islamic ulama to oversee these cases. But there was something else that bothered them over the course of the 19th century, and this was something that was particularly exacerbated by the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. Now, the increasing flow of traffic across the Indian Ocean, on the one hand, you had it was a lot easier to get arms and equipment to the Indies, and also to ship the goods that were still, coffee, indigo, sugar, which were the main products of Indonesia, back to Europe. Such connections also facilitated an astonishing rise in the number of pilgrims to Mecca. Indeed, the numbers from about 1869 to, I think, 1885 more than doubled. And indeed, by 1891, the Jawa, that is the collective term for Southeast Asians, as they were known to Arabic speakers in the Hejaz, were actually accounted the largest single community visible on the Hajj in that year. They often outnumbered even the pilgrims from much closer India. And indeed, the Dutch saw everywhere increasing numbers of Hajis and Arabs, who they often had trouble differentiating as a class. Indeed, they often referred to them simply as priests. And by the 1870s, we have rather imaginative depictions of these hajis and priests in popular books on Islam. Well, Mohammedanism, as they often refer to it. I should say this plugs into the story of the history of religions. The Dutch were actually foremost in creating these handbooks on, what are the religions of the world, what are wereldgodsdiensten, and Islam would happen to be the first one that they tackled in the book, replete with rather fanciful images like this one seen here at left, which is supposed to be a Javanese pilgrim and his wife. But what really bothered them, and I suppose I mentioned this on the last slide, was the increasing presence or increasing sightings of these hajis and pilgrims that they didn't really understand. But there were the rumours that were spread in 1881, initially among the consulates of Jeddah and Pera in the Ottoman Empire, that somehow these hajis were linking up with these particular brotherhoods known as tariqas, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, Islamic brotherhoods that would somehow receive instructions from the Sharif of Mecca or from the Ottoman Sultan. It wasn't so clear, depended to which rumour you paid attention to, and that they would activate the Muslims in these cells of these tariqa cells around the world with the turning of the Muslim year 1300, and there was going to be an enormous bloodbath around the world. And this really set off a chain of panic in the colonial offices, and people were dispatched to various local Muslim schools to try and find out what people were reading and had they heard of these rumours and had any of these letters come from Mecca to the various places in Java or Sumatra or Borneo or Sulawesi. They didn't generally find, well, they found often these letters, but they had often been written by a local person who was claiming that, that the letter had come from Mecca. There was no actual massacre that occurred in 1882, but certainly these rumours and the mistakes that had accompanied them exposed a couple of things. One was the widespread penetration and existence of one particular tariqa, and that was of the Naqshbandiya order, headquartered in Mecca. The other that was of particular concern, well, what was the other? I wish this wasn't being taped. But anyway, retrospectively, take it back. But in any case, there was this widespread connection to the Naqshbandiya and the sense that it was headquartered in Mecca, and there was still no means to understand what exactly people did in these orders and how they actually connected to them when they were there. Now, it was for such reasons that a young Dutch scholar with a horrible name, Christian Snouck Hurgronje, just known as Snouck, rhymes with book. And if you ever meet a librarian who puts it Hurgronje, or if any of you do this in bibliography, it's wrong. Seen here, standing at right, had just defended a thesis on the Hajj in 1882, and he was given a secret subvention by the Colonial Office to travel to Jeddah to interview the various pilgrims from the different parts of the Indies to sort of determine what they might get up to in Mecca. Snouck went a step further, however, and beyond taking these photos, among many others that you hear, decided to convert to Islam, and in February of 1885 went on to Mecca, where he was able to witness at close hand what the various Indonesians, I use the term anachronistically here, Indonesians got up to when they were in the holy city itself. He didn't actually witness the Hajj. Indeed, he was quite a different scandal exposed him some months later, and he was forced to leave Mecca before actually being able to participate in the Hajj. But while he was there, he was certainly able, through his connections to a wide network of Javanese and Malay and other Southeast Asian scholars and their mentors, such as Abdullah Zawawi, the son of the Qadi of Jeddah, was able to live as a Muslim and to participate in student circles, to see what people studied, and to observe, for example, the consumption of printed materials alongside handwritten manuscripts. He spent a lot of time in his subsequent narrative of the book Mecca describing how people would be drawn to the orders and how many of the people who were drawn to the Naqshbandiya, such as one teacher here seen at right, I'm not sure which of these too many is, Ahmad Lampung from Sumatra. It just says Ahmad Lampung on the back of the photo, but you have no way of telling who he is. An active Naqshbandi from Sumatra, and also the owner of a print shop. You see this co-location of print and Sufism that was going on. The dissemination of Naqshbandi works in Southeast Asia was certainly alluded to or hinted at in Mecca. Now, Snouck tended to cast with his generally cynical eye the activities of the Sufi sheikhs as being really geared to just the acquisition of money, and noted, as did some of his elite interlocutors, that it seemed very easy to join the Naqshbandiya these days, whereas membership of the tariqa had once involved a series of interviews with the sheikh, sitting with the sheikh, staying some time, being proven ability in understanding the Sharia and the associated texts with the Sharia. It seemed now that you could hang out with the sheikh for a couple of days, or perhaps hand a bit of money to your guide, and which would be passed on to the sheikh, and could even receive a mass printed ijazah, a license for the transmission of the order. These were the sort of accusations that were made. And indeed, very large numbers of Southeast Asians and people from the Caucasus were connecting to the Zawiya, the lodge of one particular Khalidi Sheikh, Suleiman Effendi, on Jabal al-Qubais, just overlooking the Haram itself. Now, it's with the observation of this large-scale connection, and you can say that the visiting of the Zawiya of al-Qubais was almost seen as part of the ceremonies. It was one of the things that you should do if you visit Mecca. I suppose it's rather like us going to Cairo, and it's, pyramids tick, Islamic Cairo tick, Coptic Cairo tick. It's that sort of, it's on the itinerary, so to speak. And indeed, this plugged in, Suleiman was just the latest of a series of Naqshbandi sheikhs representing the so-called the Khalidiyya sub-branch, based on the teachings of Maulana Khalid, a famous Naqshbandi, long resident in Baghdad, who was buried in Damascus. And indeed, it seems that the sort of techniques that he had propagated, of a shortened period with the sheikh, of particular rituals which involved the attempt to, the use of rabita, the connection with the sheikh, in which he argued that everyone had to try and visualize him in particular in order to have a mystical experience with God, was certainly something that you can see was very much behind the popularization of Naqshbandiya in Java. Now, this sort of propagation had not necessarily pleased everyone. I already mentioned that some of Snouck's elite interlocutors were not really in favour of the Khalidiyya because of their sort of cut-price, do-it-yourself, everybody-can-join-in methodologies. One particularly disturbed teacher, he was disturbed about this issue, was Sayyid Uthman of Batavia, of Arab descent, actually born in Batavia, which is now Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia. Sayyid Uthman, after his return to the archipelago in the 1860s, had also been very, very active with print. He had his own lithographic press, and he long produced all manner of primers about what is belief, the rules for the Hajj, dictionaries, short tracts on all sorts of questions. But he became particularly famous in the early 1880s for his polemical attacks on the Naqshbandis and on the Khalidis in particular, claiming that people were just being led astray by sheikhs or pseudo-sheikhs who had come back from Mecca with a very shallow knowledge of Islam and were just using this connection with Mecca as a way to drag all sorts of people in. And so it was that the natural, sequel to Snouck's journey in Mecca was a journey to Java. But what had really got him to Java in the first place was, in fact, the eruption of a small-scale massacre in the town of Cilegon, the far west of Java, here, just up here, in which members of one particular Sufi brotherhood had been involved in a sort of act of a local resistance against Dutch officials and their Indonesian allies. And it was this massacre of 1888, which was sort of the follow-up in a way to the rumours of 1882, that Snouck was able to use to his advantage, because in his book on Mecca, his 2-volume work, which concluded with a long chapter on the Southeast Asians, he had been somewhat alarmist and said the colonial state really needs to know and have someone who's in the know about what people get up to when they go to Mecca, what is the influence of the Sufi orders, and what danger they could potentially pose to the colonial state. The sorts of dangers that his friend, who he had now been in touch with, Sayyid Uthman, had been warning about for some time. So two things happened. After 1888, Sayyid Uthman's tracts condemning the Sufi orders began to be sponsored by the Dutch colonial state, quietly of course, and Snouck would himself be brought in to make a study tour of Java over the course of 1889, 1890 and into early 1891. And he didn't visit every town that we see here, but much of East Java, Central Java, and across towards the famous schools of Madiun and Ponorogo were visited by Snouck on his study tour. And what you see from his notes, his extensive notes, is he starts with very basics, you know, about life stories. You can see that he was trying to put together a sort of ethnography of the type that he had written for Mecca, but often increasingly towards the end of his questions, you could see that he was leaning towards, well, what are the books taught in the local pesantren, and what, if any, tariqa is being taught here. He was also, I should say, charged by the Dutch colonial state with working out who collected money. Indeed, the Dutch had ideas of trying to set up some sort of Mohammedan church, although Snouck didn't necessarily believe in this idea, but was well and truly prepared to take the money to go and carry out the research for something he didn't believe was feasible anyway. Because the Dutch imagined that by turning the various officials of mosques into state pensioners, they could then make sure that no money was being sent, for example, to such fields of conflict as Aceh, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. Now, on this journey, again, it's the same people who were really principal for leading him around. One was the Mecca-trained Hassan Mustafa, seen here at left, who helped him collect manuscripts, and indeed the sizable collection of Southeast Asian Islamic manuscripts that you find in Leiden today was pretty much collected on these study tours of 1889 to 1891. Just going back to my earlier point about Dutch disinterest in Southeast Asian Islam, the Leiden University Library, which is renowned today for its collection of Islamic material from the Ottoman Empire and Egypt and other places, only had about 5 Malay manuscripts in 1800 and had no one teaching these manuscripts. Many of the manuscripts were mislabeled, identified as Japanese, you name it. There was a lot of confusion. But it was only by the latter part of the 19th century that they started to even have an interest in acquiring these materials. But what interests me about the collection, and more importantly the copying of these materials, is that again they point to the importance of the Khalidiyya order. Whereas they were readily able to acquire manuscripts from the rival Shāfi'i tradition, which had been present in elite circles, and this is the point I want to make, in elite circles in Southeast Asia from the 17th century or perhaps earlier, it was very clear that people were quite willing to hand these in. They were felt to have a knowledge that wasn't necessarily up to date anymore, and the teachers who often taught Shāfi'i rituals had never been to Mecca, or this was often the accusation that was made. On the other hand, they were able to copy a lot of Naqshbandi manuscripts or collect or take note of the presence of printed materials that were being disseminated by Naqshbandi teachers. Now, Snouck was unlike previous scholars in that the usual story from the Dutch scholars is either that Indonesians had no manuscripts or no writing material really, which was often down to the fact that they usually barged into the schools wearing boots and expecting to just be handed things. But also that there were manuscripts were extremely valued in the earlier part of the 19th century. By the end of the 20th century, there was increasing information was being available and deployed in these schools that was available for purchase from places like Singapore and also Bombay and Mecca and Cairo. Mecca, I should say, from 1884 even had a dedicated scholar from Patani who was responsible for the redaction of Malay texts. Now it's also at this moment, I should say, and I don't really have a slide for this, that Snouck, I think, revealed his real interest in these manuscripts. As far as the Dutch state was concerned, he was collecting them for counterinsurgency research. Okay, this is going to be, they're going to find out who's against us and why. If you look at the manuscripts, and as Snouck was well aware, you find nothing of the sort in them. Rather, you find fairly standard sort of material. Indeed, he often didn't bother collecting, I'll just drop back, he didn't bother collecting the printed materials because, as he pointed out, you just had to look at a bookseller's catalogue and you could see what people were reading, and if you read what they were reading, there was no particular call to jihad to be found in these documents. Rather, it's very clear that Snouck, the now employed colonial advisor, and by the way, he was always much keener in working as a field man and being an advisor to the colonial state than being an academic. He didn't necessarily see that there was any contradiction in between these two roles, and I think he's the ideal Orientalist of the Saidian type, who Said absolutely misses in his work. Arguably so does Robert Irwin in his attack of Ibn Said's work, but that's another story. But increasingly in his letters, both to his mentors, such as Theodor Nöldeke in Germany and to the Colonial Office, he pointed out that he was really much more interested now in writing a history of how Islam had come to Southeast Asia and how it had made Southeast Asian Islam what it was. And he was pretty convinced that the story that would be told by all these manuscripts was of an engagement between the Sufis coming from the West and embracing or engaging with the Indic mystics that one would find everywhere, whether the Hindu or Buddhist traditions in Southeast Asia. That said, he never got to write that book. Rather, and I should say, rather with some alacrity and enthusiasm, from 1891 he would be involved in the suppression of the Acehnese in the northern tip of Sumatra. Now, the Acehnese are today famous as, supposedly the most Islamic of all Indonesians, although a lot of Malaysians are somewhat taken aback when they go to Aceh and see, well, things aren't quite so strict here at times. But certainly they have this reputation due to their long-running resistance to the Dutch. When the Dutch first invaded Aceh in 1873, they expected that, like various other principalities in the archipelago, once they captured the court, everyone would roll over and that would be it. Nothing of the sort happened, and rather, after their botched first invasion and then their second attempt, where they actually did find the court and didn't get their leading officer killed, they found that they faced a long-running insurgency led by the ulama. And it was Snouck's role in 1891 to reprise his position as the Muslim insider to gain information from people who were often captured or killed, I should say, looking at the manuscripts. And you can see that the book that he did write on Aceh, the published work that we have today, is a very famous ethnography on Aceh and Acehnese life, in which he paints Sufism as a degraded past tradition, something that would, with a movement of time, be effaced among the Indonesians, and if they were led in the right direction, that they would no longer be connected to the tariqas. Now, this role, rightly, at the end of after independence, has earned Snouck the blackest of names in Indonesia, and he's still spoken about as the particular evil weasel guy who came into Indonesia and stole their secrets. And he's often juxtaposed with another man who they think is a particularly wonderful person who came in and told them what they really want to know about themselves, and that's Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist. Although arguably Clifford Geertz's work is pretty much built on that of Hurgronje and his followers. This isn't to say that Snouck was always the enthusiastic imperialist and colonialist, and increasingly, as he became marginalised by the Governor-General, who became Governor-General on the strength of declaring the Acehnese conflict at an end, in 1906 he left Indonesia for the Netherlands and taking up the position of chair of Arabic and Acehnese, which was not a position he ever really wanted. But it was from there that he maintained his position as the leading advisor on Islam and Arab affairs, as it was called, directing the similarly named Office for Native and Arab Affairs in Jakarta, Batavia. And in his stead, the people he trained, such as G.A.J. Hazo, seen above here, and others, perpetuated his line of thinking on what Islam was and how Islam was to be managed. Now, how was Islam to be managed? I should say that soon after his tour of Java, he also dropped this line that he had, the scary line about Sufis as incipient anti-colonialists, and peddled instead, both in his official recommendations and in his sometimes anonymous letters to the Dutch press in the Indies, the idea that, well, the tariqas aren't quite what you think they are. They're not a simple, coordinated, pan-Islamic plot emanating from Mecca, but rather they are a connection of like-minded individuals interested in a deeper knowledge of God, who should not really be repressed en masse, but rather that individual teachers should be monitored for dangerous declarations, etc. And indeed, you very much see under his term of office, and also under that of his successors, the attitude to Sufism was, well, really, it's not such a big deal, it's a bygone concern, and it's far more interesting for what it tells us about Indonesian pasts than it could for Indonesian futures. And I should say they were thinking about Indonesian futures, of how Indonesians would be developed through an association, this is the term they used, with Dutch education, with European models, and be encouraged to think of Islam as something that was kept in the private sphere. The other thing that's interesting is that the officials who succeeded him and who were not usually given their marching orders to the Indies unless they'd had a stamp from him, had been trained using this body of manuscripts that he had brought back. And if you look at the sorts of theses written by the future colonial officials, they're usually some sort of study or other on Indonesian history, on a manuscript, talking about Sufi origins. The other thing that was really happening at this time, and I have neglected it in this talk today because I'm just talking about the colonial aspect of things, is the burgeoning reformist movement in Southeast Asia that was connected much more or increasingly from Singapore to the thinking of Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida in Cairo. And they were almost on the same page in many respects. In the journal Al-Imam, that was published in Singapore, a very influential journal from 1906 to 1908, it was looked on with quite some favour by Snouck and his followers who were in this Office for Native and Arab Affairs. And they weren't really, despite modern nationalist history saying that the reformists were at the vanguard of resistance to the colonial state, one often finds in the archives of the officials very either positive letters from the reformists or evidence that these reformists themselves were often the primary informants, or increasingly the informants on what Islam should be in the future. And the sort of Islam that they propagated, and by they I'm meaning here, at the centre you see Sayyid Sheikh al-Hadi, part Hadrami, part Jawi, or Sheikh Tahir Jalaluddin, who studied Al-Azhar on the right, or even their mentor, Sayyid Abdullah Zawawi, who had helped Snouck when he was in Mecca, were very much pushing the idea that the Sufi, or at least the tariqas, the popular tariqas, were a manifestation of Islam of the past, of an Islam that had gone in the wrong direction. And rather, Indonesians, for example, those who founded the politically active Sarekat Islam, the Islamic Union in 1911 in Central Java, were much more concerned with activating people in other forms, in reading newspapers, in forming welfare associations, in founding orphanages, in founding schools, in engaging in the modern, and in engaging in a way that the Dutch overseers were quite happy with, particularly when, for example, the Sarekat Islam seemed to be increasingly moving towards Roman script media rather than Arabic script media, when they began their meetings with prayers for the Dutch Queen and thanks for the provision of security by the Dutch, which allowed them to carry out proper Islamic programs. You could say that the Office of Native and Arab Affairs seemed to be riding high. Similarly, the affiliated Balai Pustaka, the Office for Public Reading, was quite enthusiastic about the dissemination of what the sorts of reading materials they thought would be appropriate for Indonesians. And that was a mixture of sort of modern sort of tracts, but increasingly stories about the past. But these were cast as, romances, Malay romances now romanized for a broader reading public. Now, active among the advisors, the Office for Native and Arab Affairs, were such men who would later become prominent Indonesian scholars. The future director of education in Indonesia, one Hussein Jaidiningrat, had started as a test case for Hurgronje. Indeed, he was the first Indonesian to gain a doctorate from Leiden University in 1909, writing appropriately enough on the history of his ancestral family in West Java. He was also, crucially, the nephew of Snouck's #1 helpmate in Jeddah, the man who had in fact facilitated his conversion to Islam. And indeed, payback for that conversion was the education for his nephews, many of whom rose to be very important both in the national movement and in the future. They often became quite famous educationalists. Another figure I'd point to at right, leaving Muhammad Basyuni aside for the moment, is Agus Salim. Agus Salim we see here was from West Sumatra, originally hoped to become a doctor, hoped to study in the Netherlands, but was chosen by Snouck to become the assistant to Abu Bakr Jainingrat in Jeddah, and he later worked very actively within the Syncretism Islam movement, which was increasingly in the early part of the 1920s starting to move away from the Dutch. But certainly the Dutch long saw Agus Salim, who, by the way, was given a salary by the Office for Public Literature and who was seen as a fellow traveller. You could say that Agus Salim would, even if he changed his attitude towards the Dutch and became increasingly opposed to Dutch rule, long maintained in his writings the same sort of story about where Islam had come from and why it had made Indonesians the way they were. And it wasn't necessarily a good thing. He was often critical of local practices, which he attributed to lack of knowledge, ignorance, and to the wayward interpretations that had come in the past. And indeed, Agus Salim, as the first foreign minister of the Republic of Indonesia, was still writing books in the wake of independence with such titles as The Story of the Coming of Islam to Indonesia, in which the narrative that he supposed was very much one shaped by Dutch scholarship. That said, I should say that not only did Snouck never get to write his book on how Islam came to Indonesia, neither did any of his followers, and they all assumed that within the body of manuscripts there was going to be the answer would be found. But what I'd like to end by saying is that, well, if you do get through those manuscripts and try and move into them, I don't think the answer's there at all. Indeed, many of them were created quite late, 18th century texts. We're seeing reappropriations of earlier stories, and we certainly don't have lineages of particular Sufi teachers that stretch way back, say, to the 13th century in Sumatra, or yet in Java, where in fact there were lots of other narratives that used to be around about how Islam had come to Southeast Asia, which didn't necessarily talk about Sufi sheikhs, which often talked instead about Chinese port captains who had married a Muslim, or who spoke about other mechanisms. But certainly what I'd like to end by saying is that we've ended up coming in this arc now where Sufis at some point, or the Tariqa mystics, who were very active in the 19th century, when the Dutch started to pay attention to Islam, they saw a very active world that they often pushed back much, much further in history and imagined had always been sort of the glue that bound people together. I'd rather argue, as I do elsewhere in the book, that this was a rather typical popularisation of Tariqa knowledge, which had actually, if you check the sources, if it was present, was much more connected to a very limited elite circle. And indeed, about the only people who were allowed to be recognised as practitioners of Sufism were such men as the king of Ternate, as seen here, holding a set of prayer beads as he goes on procession to the mosque in around 1599. And I think I've rambled enough.